We will now cover the project entry and universal data elements. The topics we will cover in this section are when to create a project entry, how to create a project entry, and how to complete common assessments. Let's talk about the project start date. The start date is considered the start of a client's period of participation with the project. It indicates a client is now being assessed by the project, and different projects may use the start date differently. For example, for street outreach, the start date is the date of first contact with the client. For emergency shelter, the start date is the date the client first stayed in the shelter. For safe havens and transitional housing, the start date is the date of the first night in residence. For permanent housing and rapid rehousing, the start date is the date the client was first admitted and can access services. For supportive services only, day shelters, homelessness prevention, and coordinated entry, the start date is when the client first began working with the project and generally received the first provisions of service. Now let's briefly talk about Universal Data Elements, or UDEs. UDEs are required to be collected by all projects in HMIS. They are collected on the client's UDE assessment. They are required to be collected for either all clients in the household or only the head of households and all adults in the household. UDEs are important for funding, planning, and improving our ability to end homelessness. Here are some examples of the data elements collected on the UDE assessment. We will discuss these elements further once we complete the assessment for our client. On the UDE assessment, a user will be collecting a client's demographic information and a homeless history. Some examples of demographic information would be the enrollment COC data element, head of household relationships, date of birth, race and ethnicity, gender, disabling condition, and zip code of last permanent address. Some examples of homeless history data elements would be homelessness primary reason, prior living situation, approximate date this episode of homelessness started, number of times homeless in the past 3 years, and number of months homeless. Again, these are just some examples. We will now complete the full assessment in Service Point. As you can see, I have already logged into Service Point, and we are now on the client profile. My client here is test, and I have already EDA'd into the project I will be entering data for. Previously, we covered the Summary tab, Client Profile, Household, and ROI tab. We are now going to complete the entry on the Entry Exit tab. Here's where you would see any previous or current entries for the client. As you can see, my client does not have any current entries. So we will complete our entry first by clicking Add Entry Exit. A dialog box will appear, and this dialog box consists of 2 sections. We have the household members up at the top and the project start date here. In the household members section, it shows any households the client has been associated with. Also, this is where you can choose which household members are going to be included in this entry. I'm going to go ahead and also include Lucy here. Next is the project start data, and the first element here is the provider. This is going to default to what you are EDA'd into. If this provider is incorrect, you're going to have to cancel the entry and change your Enter Data As mode. Do not change the project by using the Search or My Provider buttons. Next, we have Type, and we are going to select HUD, but if your project is funded by PATH, RIE, or the VA, you would choose accordingly. Next, we are going to enter the project start date. Because I am EDA'd into a permanent housing project, our start date is going to be the date the client was first admitted and could access services. If the client entered on a different date, you can backdate the project start date, but do not change the timestamp here. Once you have your project start date entered, you're going to hit Save and Continue. A new dialog box will appear, and this is where we will complete our UDE assessment. At the top of the dialog box, it lets us know the provider and type again. And then the next section here, household members associated with this entry exit, is letting us know which household members have been associated with this entry for this project. The entry assessment section lists all the associated assessments. Also, we do have this household members section. Once you are done completing the assessment for one household member, you can click on the next household member and complete their assessments. Now let's complete the UDE assessment for test. Just some couple of things to know about completing these data elements. The first thing is that all the data elements are going to be self-reported by the client, meaning you are just going to enter what the client is telling you and you do not want to make any assumptions. Also, if you are working with a client who has never been in HMIS or served by an agency, all of these elements will be blank. But since my client here, Test has had services by an agency already, we do have these data elements completed, but we have to go and still verify each data element to make sure that the information is correct. Also, if you hover over the data element, it will let you know who the data element applies to. For example, here, relationship to head of household is for all clients in all projects. And you can also see it does provide guidance for the data element. The first data element we are going to start with is enrollment COC. This is going to only have one option to select, so that is the option you will select. Moving on to relationship to head of household. Again, using the hover text, it lets us know that in a household of a single individual, that person must be identified as the head of household. In a multi-person household, only one person must be designated as the head of household, and the rest must have their relationship to the head of household recorded. If the group of persons is composed of adults and children, an adult must be indicated as the head of household. So test here is going to be the one head of household for him and Lucy. Next is the date of birth. Again, if you use the hover text, it lets us know that this is also for all clients and all projects. And it says to collect the month, day, and year of birth for every person served. If a client cannot remember the year of birth, ask the person's age and calculate the approximate year of birth. If a client cannot remember the month or day of birth, communities may record an approximate date of 01 for the month and 01 for the day. Next, we have the date of birth type. So this is asking what type of date of birth is this? Is it a full date of birth? But it also can be approximate or partial date of birth. The client didn't know, the client prefers not to answer, or data not collected. For test here, we're going to say this is his full date of birth. Next is race and ethnicity. A client can select multiple races and ethnicity. And also, again, you don't want to make any assumptions. And best practices are to either let the client know all the options available to them or show them a list of all the options that they can choose. And again, if you hover over the data element, it will provide guidance on the definitions, the HUD definitions of race, if the client had questions about that. The next data element is additional race and ethnicity details. You can go ahead and enter that information here. Next, we have gender, and it says this is for all clients and all projects, and it says which of these genders best describes how the client identifies. the client can select multiple genders. And again, you do not want to make any assumptions. And again, best practices are to either say the list of options that they have or show them a list of the genders so the client can choose. If they chose different identity, you would put the specifics here in this box. Next we have, does the client have a disabling condition? So later on in this module, we will be completing the Universal Entry Assessment, which also has a disabling condition subassessment. That subassessment and this disabling, does the client have a disabling condition data element must match. So if the client says yes here, the subassessment would need to also say yes and provide the details for that disability. Also, again, if you use the hover text, it provides the HUD definition of a disabling condition. It also points out that a disabling condition, according to HUD, has to be of long continued and indefinite duration and substantially impairs the client's ability to live independently. So that is what they are considering a disabling condition. And again, you can read the definition here so the client can better understand what we are asking. So next we have translation assistance. If the client didn't need translation assistance, you would select yes, and then it's going to ask the client's preferred language. And we have a pick list here to choose from. If the preferred language is not listed here in the pick list, you would go ahead and add that here. Next, we have the zip code of last permanent address. So this is asking for the 5-digit zip code where the client last lived for 90 days or more. You can use the zip codes listed here for clients who know the city but do not know the zip code. Since we are in balance of state, it lists counties. Next is the zip code of last permanent address. So this is asking for the 5-digit zip code where the client last lived for 90 days or more. And it says use the following zip codes for the clients who know the city but not the zip code of their last permanent address. The next section here is these eviction questions, which are for all heads of households and all adults. And so the element is asking, did you experience an eviction from housing in the last 12 months? And you would say yes or no. If yes, please select the type of eviction you experienced. And it's asking, was this a non-payment of rent COVID-19 hardship, non-payment of rent non-COVID-19 related, or other issue, non-rent related. Okay, moving on. So next we are going to be completing the client prior residence, and this is for heads of household and all adults. And the client prior residence questions are those homeless history questions that we had discussed before. But before we get into answering these, let's take a look at the questions a little further. Next, we have the client prior residence questions, and these are the homeless history questions we were discussing before. And these are for the head of household and all adults. But before we get into answering these data elements, let's take a look at these elements a bit more. So the intent of the client prior residence questions is to help determine if the client is chronically homeless, which is absolutely vital for how the client is prioritized. And so we do want users to take the time to work out the client's homeless timeline. So you would do that by working backwards and starting with their most current episode of homelessness. And this is especially important if the client has more than one episode of homelessness. And again, as I said before, these questions do affect whether the client is categorized as chronically homeless, which, if they are, that does affect their eligibility for housing. So, to help clients figure out their homelessness timeline, we recommend having the client prior residence conversation. So, this is what the field asks for compared to what a conversation should uncover. So first we have homelessness primary reason. So this should uncover, are you experiencing homelessness at this time? If so, what caused this current episode? Next we have the prior living situation. And so you could ask, what was your last living situation immediately prior to today's date? Next, we have location of prior residence. Again, you could ask instead, which city or county was this situation located in? Next is the length of stay in previous place. You could ask, how long were you in that situation? And next is approximate date homelessness started. So if the client is currently homeless, you could ask, when did your current episode begin? And you can let the client know that for data purposes, HUD is interested in counting how many episodes of homelessness they've experienced in the past 3 years from today. The way they separate one episode from another is based on a break in a period of homelessness. And the breaks are defined in the hover text. Next, we have, regardless of where they stayed last night, the number of times homeless in the past 3 years. And again, you would help the client count the episodes by identifying the breaks. And the last data element here is asking total number of months spent homeless in the past 3 years. And so this should also provide a total count of months. You should also know the definition of chronic homelessness. So the client must have a disabling condition that is of long term and impacts their ability to sustain housing, and they must have been homeless for a year straight. Or they must have a disabling condition and homeless for a total of 1 year, and that is over a 3-year period, and had at least 4 episodes of homelessness. So here we have an example of a homeless verification letter. So this example is important because this shows how those client prior residence questions and taking the time with the client to determine their chronicity, how it affects coordinating housing for the client. So case managers will use the data in HMIS to complete this homeless verification letter for the client. So again, it is important to take the time and speak with the client to figure out their homelessness timeline, which will ultimately determine whether or not they are chronically homeless. Now let's continue and complete the client prior residence data elements. So again, the first data element is homelessness primary reason, and through our conversation with the client, we found out that their homelessness primary reason was loss of employment. Also, I do want to point out that just depending on how your project is set up and your project type, You may or may not see all of these data elements, so just be aware of that. Now let's continue completing the UDE assessment by completing the client prior residence data elements. And also, depending on the type of project you're EDA'd into or the type of project you're entering data for, your selections here may look different, and that is okay. So through our conversation with the client, we discovered that their homelessness primary reason was due to loss of employment. And again, having a conversation with them, we discovered that their prior living situation was a place not meant for habitation. So once we make that selection, or once we choose a homeless situation, we have the follow-up data elements here. So next it's asking length of stay in previous place. And again, through our conversation, we found out that the length of stay in previous place was 90 days or more, but less than a year. Next, we have the approximate date this episode of homelessness started, and our client told us that this episode of homelessness started 6 months ago. So we entered April 24th, 2024. And next it says, regardless of where they stayed last night, number of times the client has been on the streets, in emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years, including today. And our client let us know that it was 4 or more times. And again, if you use the hover text, it lets you know, count all the different periods of homelessness. For example, times the client was on the streets, in an emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years. And again, if you use the hover text on the data element, this lets us know to count all of the different periods of homelessness. For example, times the client was on the streets, in an emergency shelter or safe haven in the last 3 years, where there were full breaks in between. For example, breaks that are 90 days or more in an institution, or 7 days or more in a permanent housing situation. So again, you do have to figure out those breaks with the client. Next is the total number of months homeless on the streets, in an emergency shelter or safe haven in the past 3 years. So again, if you use the hover text, it lets us know to count the number of months in which the person was homeless, and that means that they were on the street or an emergency shelter or safe haven in the past 3 years. It also says include stays in an institution that are less than 90 days or in permanent housing that are less than 7 days. And there's a note here that says if any day in a given month is spent homeless, count the full month. The example here is if the client sleeps on the street January 31st and February 1st, that counts as 2 months. So our client let us know that the number of months is more than 12 months. Next, it's asking location of prior residence, and it says for the client's prior residence, which balance of state, county, or outside region was this located in. So since we're in the balance of state site, it's giving us a list of counties. For the Maricopa site, it's going to have a list of cities. So we went ahead and selected Graham for our client. This last section here, permanent housing. So this is for permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, or other permanent housing projects. And we have the housing move-in date. So the housing move-in date is the date the client actually moves into a permanent housing unit. So the day that they actually receive keys to their unit and they are moved in. It is possible that when you're working with a client, there will already be a date listed here. You do not want to delete the date here. Only if the client is moving in on the date of their entry can you delete the date. If the client moves into their permanent housing unit after their entry date, You would update this, you would update the housing move-in date on an interim update. Next is location of housing move-in. And so this is going to list the counties in balance of state, but in Maricopa, it will have a list of cities in Maricopa County. And you would go ahead and just select which county or city the client moved to. There is one data element that is not included here in the balance of state service point. In the Maricopa, there is the access ID data element. It is not required to collect that information, but if the client does have access and they do know their access ID, it can be actually a crucial part of their housing process. So be sure to get that information if the client does have that information available. We are done with test assessment. We're going to go ahead and click save, not save and exit. We're going to click save and then scroll up and then select the next household member. I went ahead and completed their data elements. So once the next household member's data elements are complete, you'll scroll down again and select save, and then go back to the head of household, and then you will start your next assessment, which for us is going to be the universal entry assessment.